The scream was a silent, boiling thing trapped in my throat, even as the real boiling water hit my arm. It wasn't the sound of my own voice I heard, but the vicious hiss of liquid meeting skin, a sound of instant cellular betrayal. The pain was a white-hot flash, a supernova that exploded behind my eyes. And for a moment, the entire kitchen, the peeling linoleum, the humming refrigerator, the sun I no longer recognized, vanished into a universe of pure agony. Then came his voice, slicing through the haze, sharper and more scalding than the water. There, maybe that'll shut you up for good. My son Julian stood over me, the empty saucepan still in his hand, his knuckles white. His face wasn't contorted with rage, it was worse. It was a mask of cold, weary impatience, the look of a man swatting a fly that had bothered him for far too long. "God, Julian, look at the mess," his wife Chloe shrieked. But her eyes weren't on my blistering arm. They were fixed on the puddle spreading across her kitchen floor. "Now I'll have to mop. You see what you do?" She spat, her words aimed at me, a venomous dart. "You just had to provoke him, didn't you? Always stirring the pot, always needing attention. We feed you, we give you a roof over your head, and for what? So you can be a miserable old hag? Why don't you do us all a favor and just go die somewhere else? Honestly, Eleanor, nobody gives a damn." I stared at her, my face numb, my mind strangely detached from the fire consuming my arm. She stood with her arms crossed, lips curled in a perfect sneer of disgust, a queen surveying a stain on her pristine kingdom. In the corner, my grandson, 6-year-old Arya, sat frozen at his small table. His tiny fingers were wrapped around a carton of apple juice, his eyes wide and dark and bottomless. He didn't make a sound, he just watched me, his small face a canvas of confusion, trying to reconcile the grandmother who read him stories with the creature his parents had just branded. I wanted to run to him, to whisper that everything was all right, but the lie wouldn't form. Nothing was all right. My arm throbbed, an angry, screaming red against my pale skin, the blisters already rising like malevolent pearls. I looked from the burn to the two faces of my tormentors, my own flesh and blood, and the woman he'd chosen over me. They were a united front of contempt, so ready to discard me like burnt toast from a meal I had cooked but was never thanked for. A profound and terrifying calm settled over me. I said nothing. I didn't cry. I didn't scream back. I simply turned my hand, gripping the edge of the granite countertop, the one I'd picked out 20 years ago, and pulled myself upright. I walked out of the kitchen, each step a measured act of will. No one followed. No one asked if I was hurt. I passed the living room, where the armchair I used to rock Arya in sat empty. I passed the hallway, where a faint pencil mark still showed how tall Julian was at 10 years old, the day he'd run to me crying after falling from his bike. "Mama!" The word had once been a prayer, a comfort, a name that belonged to me. Now it was just a sound, hollowed out and meaningless. I reached my room, the small guest room, not the master bedroom I'd once shared with my husband, and closed the door softly behind me. I turned the lock. The click was the sound of a final decision. I slid down the cool wood of the door until I was huddled on the floor, the throbbing pain in my arm a distant drumbeat to the chilling silence from the other side. They wanted me gone, and in the silent, sterile clarity that follows immense pain, I realized I was finally ready to leave. But not in the way they imagined, not as a ghost, but as the owner. For years, I had made myself small. I had folded my opinions, my needs, my very presence into neat, unobtrusive squares to fit inside the house I had built, the house Arthur and I had poured our souls into, long before Chloe's designer shoes ever clicked across its floors. They had forgotten that. They saw me as a relic, an antique furniture with nowhere else to go. They were catastrophically wrong. With a resolve that felt foreign and yet deeply familiar, I stood, cradling my burned arm. I walked to the old cedar chest at the foot of my bed, buried beneath my late husband's wool sweaters, and the scent of mothballs and memory was a slim, leather-bound portfolio. My hands, to my surprise, were perfectly steady as I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in felt, was the original title deed to the house, dated 1989. The ink was crisp, the official seal of Lincoln County, Oregon, embossed and clear, and there was my name, Eleanor Vance, in bold, undeniable print. Sole owner. They never asked. They just assumed. They assumed my love was a contract of surrender. I closed the portfolio, placed it on the bed, and began to pack a small overnight bag. A few changes of clothes, my toiletries, a framed photo of Arthur, his smile still making my heart ache. I moved with a quiet, methodical grace, a lifetime of cleaning up other people's messes distilled into this one final, liberating act. When I zipped the bag, the house was submerged in a heavy silence. They had retreated to their room, cocooned in their cruelty, content in the belief that I was in mine, weeping and broken. I stepped out into the hallway, bag in one hand, the portfolio in the other. I walked past their closed door without a glance. The burn on my arm was a pulsing, rhythmic reminder with every step, but my spine was straighter than it had been in a decade. As I opened the front door, the cool, misty Oregon night air rushed in, and it smelled like freedom. They wanted me gone, so I was gone. But I was not empty-handed. I was not broken. I was Eleanor Avance, and I was taking the roof with me. The bus groaned through the damp, winding roads of the Oregon Coast Range, its headlights cutting feeble swaths through the thick fog. I sat in the back, the worn leather of my bag on my lap, my burned arm tucked carefully inside my coat. The windows were slick with condensation, blurring the towering silhouettes of Douglas firs into dark, watching specters. I was invisible, just another old woman running from something, or perhaps finally towards it. I got off in Cedar Creek, a town so small and forgotten, it felt like it existed in a different decade, a place Julian and Chloe had never bothered to visit, a footnote in a life I'd lived long before them. It was a town of moss-covered roofs and a single traffic light that blinked yellow after 9 p.m. I walked the 4 blocks from the bus stop to the cottage. Arthur and I had bought it in our 30s, a rustic little place tucked away on a parcel of land thick with cedars and wild rhododendrons. We poured the concrete for the foundation ourselves, his rough, steady hands guiding mine. His fingerprints were embedded in the very bones of this place. The gate shrieked its familiar rusty protest. The key was still under the 3rd terracotta pot, exactly where I'd left it 20 years ago. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old books, dried herbs, and memory. I flipped a switch, and a single dusty bulb flickered to life, illuminating a room frozen in time. The furniture was draped in white shrouds, ghosts of a life I had put on pause. I sat on the edge of the bed we had once shared, the mattress sighing under my weight. This cottage, this land, it was all mine, paid for with overtime shifts as a nurse and Arthur's long weekends at the timber mill. We had dreams for this place, a sprawling garden, a workshop for him, a porch swing for me. Then the cancer came for him, swift and silent as the coastal fog, and the dreams were packed away with his clothes. When Julian married Chloe, it had seemed like a sensible, loving thing to do, letting them move into the big house in Port Blossom. They were just starting out. The house was too large for just me. I'd willingly moved into the smaller bedroom, surrendering the master suite, the heart of the home. I became their live-in cook, cleaner, and babysitter, all for the unspoken price of my own erasure. I remembered Chloe's first day. She'd walked in, her nose wrinkled at the scent of old books and lemon polish. "We'll need to renovate," she'd announce. Not to me, but to Julian. running a manicured finger over the windowsill, as if checking for flaws in my life's work. Soon, Eleanor, she'd tell her to not use my good towels. Why is she always humming? Does she have to sit with us during dinner? Julian, my son, never once defended me. He stood by, a silent accomplice, his spine dissolving under the heat of his wife's contempt. But I had told myself it was fine, that this was the price of family. I was a fool, but even fools have their limits. In the back of the cedar wardrobe, past Arthur's old flannel shirts, was a small fireproof safe. I spun the combination, the numbers of familiar prayer on my fingertips. Inside, next to our wedding album, was a second portfolio. It contained the deed to this cottage and the land it sat on, and a stack of bank statements. Forgotten who owned the house. They had forgotten who I was. I wasn't a guest. I wasn't a burden. I was a builder, a provider, the architect of the very life they had so casually tried to dismantle. I held the deeds in my hands, the paper cool and solid. It wasn't just proof of ownership, it was proof of my existence. The next morning, after a restless night listening to the wind whisper through the cedars, I looked up a number I hadn't dialed in 15 years. Ruth Bennett. She was now Isabel Morrow, having taken her husband's name. But I knew the fire in her would be the same. My best friend from nursing school, sharp, ferocious, and loyal to a fault. I'd heard she'd left nursing, gone to law school late in life, and now specialized in something they called elder rights. I dialed. After 3 rings, a voice, crisp and professional, answered, "Isabel Morrow?" There was a long pause after I said my name, then a soft gasp. "Ellie! My God, Eleanor Avens, is that really you? Are you all right?" "I've been better, Izzy," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "But I'm still standing, and I need a lawyer." "You don't need a lawyer," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "You need a friend with a law degree. I'm on my way. Whatever it is, we'll burn it to the ground together." And just like that, a bridge to my past appeared. Not to retreat across, but to bring reinforcements. The storm was coming for Julian and Chloe, and I, Eleanor Avens, was the storm. Isabel arrived 3 days later, her sensible sedan kicking up a cloud of gravel and autumn leaves. She stepped out wearing a tailored blazer over jeans, her silver hair in a no-nonsense bun, but her eyes were the same, sharp, intelligent, and missing nothing. She hugged me, a fierce protective embrace that spoke more than words. At the small kitchen table, under the dim light of the cottage, I laid out my arsenal. The title deed to the house in Port Blossom, the deed to the cottage, decades of property tax receipts paid by me, utility bills in my name. I laid them out like tarot cards, predicting a future they had never seen coming. Finally, I rolled up my sleeve and showed her the burn. The skin was a raw, weeping map of their cruelty, shades of angry red and purplish blue. Isabel's face hardened into granite. She didn't gasp, she didn't offer empty platitudes. She just looked at it, then at me, and a cold, controlled fury lit her eyes. "This is not just disrespect, Ellie. This is assault. This is elder abuse. We're not just getting them out, we're going to make them remember your name." They just assumed, I began, my voice trailing off. They assumed it was theirs. I let them. "That ends today," she said, pulling out a yellow legal pad. Her pen began to fly across the page. "Tell me everything. Every insult, every time you felt invisible, every time they made you feel like a ghost in your own home. Dates, if you can remember." "I remember," I said softly. "You don't forget the day your child tells you to disappear." And so I told her. I told her about Chloe misplacing my medication, about being left alone during a winter storm while they vacationed in Hawaii, about holidays where I was relegated to a folding chair in the corner while their friends sat at the dining table I had polished for 30 years. I recounted every cut, every bruise to the soul, painting a portrait of a slow, deliberate execution of my spirit. "I'm drafting an eviction notice," Isabel declared, her voice devoid of emotion. "It's called a notice to quit. Given the uncontested deed and the documented abuse, no judge will even hesitate. They'll have 30 days to vacate. Can I really do that? The question was a whisper, the last gasp of the woman who was trained to keep the peace at any cost. Isabel reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. Her touch was firm, grounding. You must do that, Eleanor. This isn't revenge. This is a course correction. You're correcting the dangerous assumption that love means you have to endure abuse. You're not just taking back a house. You're taking back your life. That night, for the first time in years, I transferred money from my secret savings account into my checking. Enough for Isabel's fees, enough to buy a new coat, enough to remind myself that I was not helpless, not destitute, not a charity case. I was a woman of means, my own means. The eviction papers were filed the next morning at the Lincoln County Courthouse. I signed my name, Eleanor Avance, on the petitioner line. The pen felt heavy, each letter a deliberate, final stroke drawing a line in the sand that could never be undone. As we stepped out into the crisp autumn air, I didn't feel cruel. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tall. I felt like the towering cedars around me, weathered and scarred, but still reaching for the sky. I had just evicted my own son, but what I had truly done was serve notice to the world and to myself that I was still here. The phone call came exactly 6 days later. The sheriff had hand-delivered the notice that morning. I let Julian's number go to voicemail 3 times. The 4th time, I picked up and said nothing. "Mom." His voice was a raw wire of disbelief and fury. "What the hell is this? An eviction notice? Are you out of your mind? You're throwing your own family out on the street?" Silence. My silence was a wall he could not breach. His tone shifted, the anger dissolving into a pathetic whine. "Mom, come on. We were just stressed. Chloe's been under a lot of pressure. You can't do this. We're your family." The word family hung in the air, grotesque and hollow. He pleaded, he threatened, he begged, he said he was sorry, he said he loved me. He said all the words he should have said years ago, but they were no longer currency. I listened without a word. I gently placed the receiver back in the cradle. The connection was severed in every possible way. At the end of the 30 days, they were gone. Isabel told me they left in a rage, leaving behind a mess of discarded belongings and shattered entitlement. The neighbors watched as 2 sheriff deputies stood by to ensure the court order was followed. The house I had built with love was emptied of hate. I never stepped foot inside it again. The memories were too toxic, the ghosts too loud. Instead, I called a local nonprofit, an organization that helped women, particularly elderly women who had been displaced or were fleeing abusive situations. I spoke to the director, a kind-faced woman named Maria. "I have a house," I said, "a fully furnished 3-bedroom house in Port Blossom. The deed is clear. I want to turn it into a sanctuary, a safe haven. No rent, just a place for women who have nowhere else to go to find their footing again." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. "Mrs. Vance," she finally said, her voice thick with emotion, "you have no idea what a gift this is." Oh, but I did. 2 weeks later, the first resident moved in. Her name was Mabel. She was 72, with hands gnarled from arthritis and eyes that held the haunted look of someone who had been told she was worthless one too many times. Her son had sold her home out from under her to pay for his gambling debts. I was there to give her the key. As she stepped over the threshold, she looked around the clean, quiet living room and burst into tears. "There's heat," she whispered, holding her hands out as if to warm them by an invisible fire. "Real heat?" "Yes," I said, my own eyes stinging, "and clean towels, and no one will ever yell at you here." I didn't want revenge. I wanted reclamation, not just of my property, but of my purpose. The house in Port Blossom was no longer defined by the pain it had housed. It was now defined by the healing it offered. One afternoon, I drove to town and bought a small piece of polished cordwood and some carving tools. I spent the evening on the porch of my cottage, carefully carving letters into the wood. The next day, I drove to Port Blossom and hung the sign on the front gate of my old house, right under the mailbox. It was visible to anyone who passed by. It read, "The Haven, a sanctuary built by a woman who was told to die elsewhere." I didn't need an apology. I didn't need them to understand. I needed every woman who drove by, every person who heard the story, every soul who felt invisible and discarded to see that sign and know that you can't truly evict a woman from a world she helped build. They wanted me gone. Instead, I created a place for others to arrive. They tried to erase my name. Instead, I carved it into a promise. They took my home, so I took the roof, the very idea of shelter, and gave it to those who needed it most. And in that quiet, revolutionary act, I finally truly came home to myself.